Hello everyone, okay then, so on this video as you can see we're going to start our work on the Conservative Party. Now this PowerPoint is going to go over some of the history of the Conservative Party. Now you're not going to be asked an exam question, explain the history of the party, but it is quite useful to know kind of where it comes from, where its kind of origins are. I suppose placing it in context, that's kind of the posh phrase for what this video is going to do. So, to begin with then, a few key features of the Conservatives. The first one, I'm going to let it change pages, here we go. The first one is the Conservative Party is a party of the right of centre. So all that stuff you've done about ideology, the idea of supporting individualism, disliking radical change, supporting things like law and order because human nature is fundamentally flawed. All that type of stuff is kind of where the Conservative Party is, ideologically speaking. They support the free market and capitalism. They support tradition and want to uphold tradition. Look how quickly it was for Boris Johnson to go on the telly defending them singing in the last night of the Proms, for example, on the BBC a few weeks ago. That's a recent example of that. And they are pragmatic. That means they're willing to change some of their core ideas or some of their ideas or some of their policies to what they think works and what they think is popular. Because the Conservatives have been very good throughout their history of retaining power, being in office. They are the most successful party. I think they're the most successful in Europe in terms of longevity, as opposed as being in government. So they're a very successful party in that regard. Now, a quick history of the Conservatives, ignore the Benjamin Disraeli bit for this moment. The modern Conservative Party was really started in the 1830s by Sir Robert Peel. He came from Bury in Lancashire and became the MP for Tamworth. And he was Prime Minister during the 1840s. He's quite famous for setting up the police service in the 1820s under Lord Liverpool's government. And there's a picture of him. And for most of the 19th century, the party was really in favour of free trade and tradition, and they opposed many of the reforms put in place by the Whigs and the Liberals, who were their main opponents. Now, the party changed in the 1860s due to this man on the left, who is Benjamin Disraeli. He becomes Prime Minister in the 1860s. He's Prime Minister on a couple of occasions, and he founds this one nation conservatism. And what that basically means is that by the 1860s, most middle-class men had the right to vote, and even one or two of the more respectable working classes, the kind of the richest working classes. So lots of small businessmen, shopkeepers, these sorts of people now had the vote. And Disraeli recognised that unless the Conservatives became attractive to those voters, then they wouldn't win any elections. So therefore they had to have policies and ideas that were attractive to those people. He was also concerned about the great divisions in Victorian England between the very rich and the very poor. And one of his main concerns is that, the very poor have nowhere else to go apart from reading radical works, people like, for example, Karl Marx. And one of his fears is obviously some kind of uprising, some rebellion, some kind of revolution. So it's better to make the changes now and appease those people before they impose much more radical change on the country. Okay, so as I said here, the Conservatives had to appeal both to the middle classes and the less well-off in society, which is something which they do, and they're very successful at it. Now, this view of the Conservatives really holds up until the mid-1970s. And just to show you about the post-war governments, okay, they were in power for 17 years out of 29, between 45 and 79. They were very pragmatic. So, for example, those policies which Labour introduced after the Second World War, like the NHS, nationalising some key industries, the Conservatives said, oh, these are really popular, we too will support these things. So they remained very pragmatic. They did support free markets, but they also supported things like the welfare state and other kind of one nation traditions which Labour had introduced after the Second World War. Now, these are some of the prime ministers in this period. So we also got Winston Churchill, Anthony Eden, Harold Macmillan, Douglas Home, and here we have Edward Heath. Now, the Conservatives really change with Mrs. Thatcher. She becomes Conservative leader following the fall of the Heath government in 1974. So I think it's 1975 she becomes the leader. And she's quite a radical Conservative. She's very different to those One Nation Conservatives. In her time of office, she was far more ideological. She had a set view on economics, which she was not to be dissuaded from, and against quite a lot of opposition, she was determined to bring into fruition. She sought to break up this cosy post-war consensus and had some much more radical changes. She was very strongly anti-trade unions. She passed a number of laws against the trade unions. She has conflict with the miners, for example. Very strong supporter of free market capitalism, and very much supporter of privatisation, selling off some of the industries which have been run by the state, and also advocating a much smaller state. The state should be far less involved in people's lives than it was previously. Her downfall in 1990 was quite dramatic in November 1990, and the circumstances of her downfall did lead to repercussions for the Conservatives and kind of led to their defeat in 1997 at the general election. She had been a very successful Prime Minister. She'd led 3 strong Conservative governments. Some in the Conservatives did not want to see her go. Others in the Conservative Party were very keen to see her go. A lot of divisions emerged, especially over the issue of Europe and Britain's involvement in the European Community, or EU, as it later became. Now, this man became the Prime Minister following Thatcher's downfall. It was her former Chancellor, John Major, and he really struggled to keep the party together. He was less of a forceful character, less ideological than Mrs. Thatcher, and far more pro-European. And the divisions in the party led to a crushing defeat of the Conservatives in the election in 1997. This is the year when Tony Blair wins those big landslides in that particular election year. Following the defeat by Tony Blair, the Conservatives are really in the wilderness for the next 13 years, and they really struggle to kind of come back to the political fore. It's the longest period they've been out of office since the 1830s. They're down to the fewest number of MPs as well they've ever had since like the 1830s or something like that. So they really are a small rump compared to their previous status. They then lost 3 more general elections in a row. Okay, 1997 they lost, 2001 and 2005. And these were the various leaders they had in this time. So you had William Hague, Ian Duncan Smith and Michael Howard. These 3 kind of led the party in literally between 1997 and 2005. So they had quite a lot of turbulence at the top, kept changing their leaders. And it wasn't until 2010 when the party saw their winning ways again with this character, David Cameron. And he tried to bring the party back much more to the political centre. In terms of economics, I would argue that he did support Thatcherism, but in terms of social policy, he was far more kind of modern, perhaps more of a One Nation tradition, you might argue, but certainly was quite different to what had gone before. In 2010, he has to form a coalition with the Liberal Democrats in order to form a government, and then in 2015, he's the first Conservative to actually win a general election in his own right since 1992. So he achieved that victory in that particular election. Following the whole Brexit situation, then Theresa May succeeds him. She becomes the new Prime Minister in 2016, and as we all know, the general election she fought in 2017 had mixed results, I think it's fair to say. I haven't put it on this slide, but obviously in 2019 she resigns. We then have Boris Johnson, who then wins the biggest majority for the Conservatives since 1987. Obviously, 1 year into the Johnson government, it's hard to really evaluate where he is with stuff, and he's obviously been very busy with the whole COVID-19 situation. So that just gives you an idea of the Conservatives. Now, what I wanted to focus on is one nation conservatism. And to do that, I have scanned some pages from the Paul Cordy book. He does a really nice explanation in a table of the one nation conservatism. And in your booklet, you will see there's a page with a blob in the middle which has one nation conservative in the middle. What I'd like to do is draw like a spider diagram or some form of diagram explaining and showing the key features of one nation conservatism and how that translates, I suppose, into ideas and policies. So that is your first job. After that, we then need to look at Thatcherism, and there's a DVD, and I'll send you out the details of how to access the DVD, which again you need to be watching. So do the stuff on one nation conservatism, and as I said, I'll send out an email with the links and things on to this video I would like to watch on Thatcherism.